All right, we are about to start. Let me just turn over the camera. I don't know if it is really necessary. So can I scan the check-in QR code? Thank you. Can I scan the check-in QR code? I think I will also share screen to the questions in case we don't have access to this. Yeah, thinking. Yeah. I think we are free to start. There's aren't many people in this session, I guess. But yeah. I'll introduce myself. My name is Gary Grant. I am a statistical analysis, modeling analysis from HCheck. So I will be host and coordinate with this session today. I just joined HCheck last week, so I'm totally green hands. Still a lot to learn, and yeah. So I think today we are going to talk about the benchmarking, and there are 8 questions of today's. Yeah. This is for benchmarking. Sorry. Benchmarking. Oh, okay. Oops.
If there aren't many people here, is it worth us introducing ourselves?
Sure.
Do you think?
Yeah.
So I'm Lindsay McCall. I'm a statistician at Select Statistics. I've worked with Tony at HCheck on work for the ICO and Ofcom on measuring the accuracy of age assurance technologies.
I'm Jen. I'm the engineering tech lead of the age assurance team at Google.
Yeah. Anyone online want to introduce yourself? Or we can just start. So the background is part 2 of this ISO concentrate on the process of for the measurement, testing, and comparability of age assurance system based around a series of international standards, information technology project performance benchmarking framework. So how should these benchmarking activities be structured and reports produced within conformity assessment and certification activities? I also share screen the 8 questions. So this. So we are free to say anything or
Do we just go through them?
I guess so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm coming at it from quite a statistical point of view. I'm not in the age assurance world, if that makes sense. I've worked with Tony to provide statistical support, but I know certainly in terms of performance indicators, we were very much focused on performance indicators of binary outcomes, because even if, whether it's an age verification or an age estimation, even if it's an age estimation, it's a continuous outcome, it'll naturally be
mapped into the binary.
Exactly. So I know that in the ISO that they're putting together, they wanted to put together like a simple overall headline metric. So for example, just accuracy, but then the issue with accuracy is it doesn't really tell you anything about what kind of errors you're getting. So the idea that you would then like back that up with secondary measures like your true positive rate, your true negative rate, predictive values, those sorts of things, so that you could delve deeper into actually understanding what the accuracy is of the system, what kind of errors you're getting, etc. So that was my sort of understanding of it.
Yeah, I found it interesting that the previous draft of the standard in part 1, it was talking about different assurance levels and was defining them based on accuracy. And that's fascinating to me because it means if you happen to have a user population that's over 90% adult, you've accomplished like basic age assurance without doing anything at all. Just by virtue of having a mostly adult user population, you have basic age assurance. And I think most people would agree that that isn't really doing much that we would view sufficient in the age assurance space. So I think we need to be looking more at how often we're incorrectly categorizing children, and whether we're providing appropriate protections given the risk level of the content that's being gated. I mean, I think there's also measurement, for example, of additional friction we might be adding to adults. And in particular, if you, for example, have estimation methods needing to fall back to more concrete methods that gather more data, though users also has some harm for adults if your estimation is poor. So for example, if we needed every single user to upload their full government ID, that becomes problematic for different reasons. So it's not just the children that's something to measure, but I think those are sort of the two axes that I personally think about to some degree.
Because I guess what you're saying is that the more information that you require from somebody to get through that barrier, like it is causing more friction for that person,
and essentially more privacy exposure of their data.
Exactly, like a GDPR issue, for sure.
I think it's also sort of interesting if you talk about benchmarking, there's like a couple of different things you could measure. You could measure how often users could present falsified information. So for example, are they able to spoof our process in some way? What percentage of users are taking a photo of somebody else's ID, for example? Or is it just given an ID, for example, if you're doing something like that tries to extract a birthday from an ID, how often is that thing accurate? And those are sort of very different problem spaces. And I'd say in general, a lot of measurement suffers from a lack of really solid ground truth data. Especially when you're looking at children being the people that you need data about to do benchmarking, and children's data has a lot of very strict handling guidelines and policies, which makes it very tricky to gather as a large scale ground truth set.
We had some workshops last year, and the test data set was like one of the biggest things that people were like challenges I think that people have is that how do you have an appropriate independent test data set, which also then with the ethics considerations of having sufficient a younger population in there, and then also making sure that it's representative of the population in terms of like protected characteristics and things like that. And should there be a data set available for people to a single data set available, and if there was, who's going to do that and who's going to curate it, and who's there definitely felt like there was a lot of it felt like a within this workshop space a very everybody was in agreement that this was a really big challenge. I wonder about the benchmarking, about the overall accuracy, because I think that for me, and I don't know whether this is with the ISO, I understand the point that you made. I guess for me, one of the things that I feel where accuracy or all of these other measures they're only meaningful in the way that you design your test. Do you see what I mean? And so I understand what you're saying about like looking at the whole of the adults, but I guess like from my statistical point of view, and I don't know how realistic this is in terms of the ISO and benchmarking, but I feel that, you know, if you're the way that you test your data set, or sorry, test your technology should reflect how it's going to then be deployed in real life. So for example, if it's going to be deployed to say, are you over 18 or are you under 18, then it shouldn't be, then, you know, maybe you should be setting up your test to be effectively focusing on, you know, 18 plus or minus 10 years, or do you see what I mean? So that then you're sort of, your accuracy is then telling you something about that kind of buffer around the threshold that you're probably most interested in, because you know that 60-year-olds are effectively going to pass it, and you know that 2-year-olds aren't, you know, do you see? And then I think maybe the accuracy might be more helpful, useful, or and the false positive rates. I don't know what you think of that.
I mean, from a pure statistical perspective, I think evaluating the accuracy to some of the levels laid out in the current age assurance level framework is basically impossible. Like 99.99%. If you want 95% confidence you met that, you start getting things like, okay, let's evaluate a government IP-based solution in Australia. Congrats, your ground truth data set is twice the population of Australia.
I mean, those numbers are definitely not, well, that's where that's not really, like, you know, I think, because the next session is about that. And yeah, I haven't been involved in setting what those numbers should be, and because I don't know how. Yeah, I mean, 99.99%, that feels very unachievable. I don't know. Is that I don't know. And then also the other thing, when I look at that from a statistical point of view, I don't even know how you reliably show that you're 99.99%, 99.9, like 1 in 10,000. I don't know how you reliably show that, because to get, I mean, your sample size would have to be
massive,
huge to get that, right? Like you know, you need, because if it's 1 in 10,000, like how many samples do you know, you really need a huge sample to like reliably show that you're within, you're 99.99% plus or minus some kind of margin of error, right? Yeah, so I agree about those numbers, but I was just interested in the idea about whether, you know, I guess for me, in all of these things, it's about setting out and designing how you're testing the system to basically reflect the real world, because otherwise I worry that any measure that you come up with could effectively be meaningless or could be gamed. Is that fair?
That is fair to some degree, and I think it's an interesting question in the standard space. If they ever want to certify that people meet a standard, what test data set do you use that's properly representative? You could have age assurance solutions that operate in a lot of different conditions and have very different user populations. And I don't know how you would accurately certify performance of a given system in terms of actually running concrete tests. I suppose you could check that a system had certain characteristics in how they were designing their measurement and testing, and were aligned with best practices in those ways. But I'm not sure if there is a good way to generalize a data set or method of benchmarking that can apply to all different systems in all different jurisdictions.
Yeah. 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 Sorry. Yeah, it's really, I'm trying to think. So how are we doing on these questions? I don't know where we've got to. Can they be standardized across? So your feeling is no, they can't be. It's not something that can be standardized. Yeah.
Certainly, you could come up with some generally available data sets to at least make it so that people have access to some amount of data. I'd say that access to data is something that not all people who are needing to age assurance will necessarily innately have the resources to spin up.
Yeah.
And I think as a global community, it makes sense to create some amount of standard availability of test data that allows for even smaller companies to be able to try something in the space. Otherwise, I think you're leading towards extreme centralization to some extent. But I also don't know how you could ever use that type of test data in any form of accreditation or to handle all cases, or it's like necessary but not sufficient. That was
Yeah. Yeah.
To be honest, I don't know even where to get the test data, because as far as I know from our company HCheck, we only have some fake IDs, so we can test them on fake IDs through some models to see whether this model can detect this is a fake or it's a proof. But currently, I think we don't have much access to the real test data, which not mentioning about the adolescent or young people. So yeah, how to get more access to the test data would be.
I think there's also some really fascinating new approaches in the age assurance space. Like I think one of the later sessions was something like using EKGs
Yes.
to try to determine someone's age, and who's going to come up with a test data set of heartbeat rhythms
Well, exactly.
or that are correlated
Or-
to users' age. I think that's generally like you're almost trying to design something so generic that you have to have every single possible natural feature of a human being all
Yeah.
in one big system.
Yeah.
And not to mention also, like, a lot of the things we use in age assurance space are government IDs, and those have massive variance between different regions.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
the security features they have, the data that they contain, etc.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think most of them are using OCR to scan some information from their IDs, especially if the IDs contains their birth of year, birthday, so they can easily calculate whether they are over 18 or not. Yeah, but I also heard some people saying you can scan your own hands to detect whether you are.
Yeah, I heard about
Very
that. Yeah, the
interesting,
hand
very
one.
interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like it's such a rapidly moving industry. It's hard to really pin down something now that will necessarily, will it be future proofed? Like you said, I mean, a data set is not just necessarily an image of faces. There's so many other things that, yeah.
Yeah, it will be a chaos for us to check to do the data set to formalize a standard if there are so many ways to so if there are so many kind of data. Well, okay, we can move on to next question.
Biases. I guess here again, it feels like the framework can best provide a framework for how one should evaluate that. I think there are a lot of best practices that could be encoded, but I don't know if there's one inherent test, especially since there's so many different axes in which a system could be biased, and I'm not even sure some of them are terribly measurable.
No.
Like I think racial bias is something that has been covered a lot, and
Yeah.
But I think there's even things like socioeconomic bias, and sometimes that's even coming into access to IDs in the first place. So
Yeah.
inherently, anything that collects a government ID is going to be biased towards people who have access to having a government ID, and no data set is going to be able to measure that bias. You can have a data set of people with no government ID to analyze government.
Because you've got all these different types of biases. So like, yeah, if you've got biases in the data that you're training the model, then that, yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, yeah, you're right. Yeah. I mean, there's like it feels like there's quite a lot out there. There's quite a lot in the Alan Turing. He's got, there's a quite a long report on biases and things like that. I mean, I think in the ISO that they're putting together, they're focusing on sort of outcome parity. So this idea of comparing, comparing like your error rates between genders or between ethnicities, or again, it feels tricky when you become, because obviously there's like intersectionality and things like that, but then the problem again is you become, as you sort of go into more detail, and then your sample sizes become small, don't they?
I do also worry that users who are the most underserved are users who are unique in unique ways. And how would you even measure for bias with somebody with an extremely unique, for example, facial deformity, in terms of how that impacts a solution based on photos? And I don't actually know if there are good solutions there beyond just providing a lot of different mechanisms for age assurance to ensure that users have some option that will work for them.
Yeah,
But at the end of the day, I don't know that you ever could truly ensure parity in outcomes for any specific method.
no, and then if you can't show that there is parity, then I guess you probably want to show that it's good enough. But then how do you define what good enough is? Do you see what I mean? Where is the, if it deviates, like how much does it have to deviate for you to red flag it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we just need to run the model and run the test to see, okay, what the biases are, like what's the difference between different ratios, between different socioeconomic class, to get the data. So, and then we can discuss more about this bias or how we improve it in our models or whatever. Yeah.
Also sort of interesting, and then I'd say that some biases are somewhat present in the input data before it even gets to our age assurance processes. For example, if you look at different brands of phone cameras, they might do better with darker skins in terms of how they process an image coming from the camera.
Yeah.
And at that point, there's sort of a question of not just someone's race, but what phone camera are they using to take their picture with? And are you inheriting some of those biases from your collection mechanisms?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know there are some papers they are doing different cameras like comparison. I hope so. It will be a part of variables in the data. Ooh. Actually, I don't think there is anyone online right now. Anyway, we don't need to.
I wonder if maybe it's a microphone. I know some people have said that the laptop microphone doesn't do a good job of picking. So I wonder if people were going to join something else, because I think some of the other sessions had passed around.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think there's also another session going on, which is about intraceability. And which is, I think, more interesting, to be honest.
That is a hot topic
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
Too much of a,
yeah. I would go there if I'm not a host here. So we can move on to the third question. Methodologies and framework to ensure the consistent and reliable benchmarking report and the transparency and peer review. Wow.
I feel a bit less on firm ground with this question.
Yeah. A benchmarking report. A report for benchmarking?
I mean, I suppose you could come up with a structure for how people should test their systems and what data they're required to report about their systems in order to get certification, and what details they're required to report about their systems in order to get certification. And perhaps that's reasonable to some degree. I do know at a certain point, there sometimes is some special thoughts that companies use where nobody's going to want to externalize every single line of code in their system.
Oh yeah, no, I don't think that's, no, I don't
But
think that's,
at a certain point, how do you genericize enough that people feel comfortable sharing those details to a certification group while still getting sufficient details in data handling and practices and benchmarking practices to form an opinion on whether it should be certified. I guess the question is, how do you make it meaningful of a certification without making it too complex to do in a scalable way, or too complex for people to want to go through?
I think I just joined this company a week. So, but I thought there are some indicators like the liveness of the document, liveness of your face, or is it face verification, whether you are the person of the picture. So I think there are some indicators of a model. So each model normally the result is binary, but you can have multiple results in terms of the liveness of different things, and if this document is true or not fake it. So there are many small things to detect whether the whole thing is true or qualified. So I think it can be a part of the benchmark report or standard.
That seems to assume a specific solution, though. How would you benchmark, say, the EKG solution someone was mentioning? And what would that look like? What would certification, would we just say that certain methods aren't available for certification? It also feels like when writing a standard, like we want to be future looking, and I'm not sure that what we're designing today is necessarily where age assurance will be in a decade from now, and how that will evolve. And I worry that if we index too much on specific solutions and how we design a benchmarking framework, we're somewhat limiting the lifetime of the standard. And I'm not really sure how to balance that, because it feels like a lot of this often does need to be more specific to be useful, but also I do think there needs to be some flexibility for unique solutions and for the technology to evolve, because this is very new technology.
Yeah.
Okay, we can move on to next.
He's already
Yeah, I feel like we've done number 4, kind of talked about number 4, haven't we?
Yeah.
And the fact that, and the diverse and regulatory contexts. Yeah, it's really hard to know how to make them, how to future-proof it. It's like our unknown unknowns, isn't it?
And there is such a different patchwork of regulatory requirements and context as well. For example, some regions, if you're collecting IDs, allow for users to redact certain parts of their ID when they upload a photo of it. And that's its own beast that you have to compare with other regions that don't require that redaction, or would explicitly require that certain fields be visible, for example. But also I think we see different rules for data handling in different regions. The viability of creating a data set that involves children's data and how that would need to be handled might vary from region to region, depending on their children's data laws. So I think a lot of that is challenging, especially if you're trying to account for the uniqueness of certain regions, and bias certainly needs to be done almost on a regional basis to ensure you're being appropriate, which is a challenge as well.
But it feels like they do need to put regulation in place, and they do need to provide some guidance as to the sorts of things that people should be reporting, so that those people who are giving over their personal data or applying that technology within their industry can be confident that it is doing what it says it's doing.
Yes.
So it's a really it's just a really difficult, because it feels like if it's too vague, then it's not helpful, but it also feels like if it's too specific, then
not helpful.
Well, it's going to be hard to apply across different regions,
and possibly regulators will eventually realize some of these complexities and will start to align more and more regulation to look more similar in terms of what the provisions are for age assurance and how it needs to be performed. I think upfront we're seeing a very large patchwork just because there isn't one standard solution yet, and possibly as the technology evolves, it might inform regulation to align on more of a standard. At which point, it almost feels like we're a little early on designing standards. We're almost designing a standard for technology that doesn't even fully exist yet, and what that should look like.
Exactly.
So you can come up with generic ideas for how you measure a given system, and generic ideas and more specific ideas for how to measure specific implementations of that sort of system that we believe people might be using, but I'm not sure how you truly merge the two.
So the next topic is about the challenges associated with benchmarking age assurance system in diverse cultural or regulatory contexts. How can benchmarking methodology be adapted to account for this variation while maintaining consistency and comparability?
I mean, I think you sort of touched on this really, haven't you? Jen, I think this idea that different regions are going to have different regulations and different laws associated with the data and things, it's difficult to, yeah, to make it consistent across them. I think the next question is that key one that you were saying about how do we make sure that standards remain relevant and up to date in the face of rapid innovation. I mean, it feels to me like some of the measures that they're sort of that's, you know, like I said, it is becoming almost everything, whether it's a face, whether it's an ID, whether it's your heart, like your heart rate, you know, it is ultimately going to say, are you more, I'm just saying 18 because like, it could be different thresholds. Are you over 18 or are you under 18? So there are a basic set of metrics that you can, that will apply to all of those things, right? You know, like a binary, you know, I'm sure that a lot of these companies like Google and Yoti and Privately and all of that, they produce accuracy statistics in terms of like, yeah, your confusion matrix and your sensitivity and your specificity. And
there is also the unsure bucket for what it's worth. I think binary is not a perfect classification. It's more like yes, no, or not sure.
And there's a workshop on that on Wednesday. And I think that's, yeah. And I guess like one of the ways they were talking about doing that was like an age buffer, but maybe it's actually have yes, no, and unsure. If you had yes, no, and unsure, I'm guessing you would treat, it's almost like two separate processes. You'd be like with the unsure, I guess I would be interested to know out of the proportion of I'm assuming the unsures are the ones closest to the threshold.
Hopefully.
So I guess that's what I want to know. I'd be like, out of the subjects, like what's the proportion of unsures? And then I want to know like are these old people that are close to the threshold? I'd want to know about the difference between their ages between there and the threshold. That like there's a set of metrics about the unsures that I'd want to know. And then for those where you have labeled them, you would then do your you know, confusion matrix with your sensitivity. And I feel like those measures are sort of robust to the future, as long as you design your test and you have the right test data. I feel like there's a lot of caveats associated with that. I don't know, is that a fair?
I think so. I think something more generic is almost what we're going to be forced to move towards as well, because it's not even the case that all systems will be like looking at 18 plus, maybe still
definitely
13 plus.
Mm-hmm.
And what a selfie model that looks at 13 plus versus 18 plus needs of the test data that are going to be massively different.
Yeah, and I think you're right, because I think like, and I think it's not even, so it could be, I mean, we had like, there's lots of different examples, but like, it could be like a safe space for 13 to 16-year-olds. And then, do you see what I mean? So are you in 13 to 16 or are you out? You know, like, you're right. There's like, I mean, I'm just choosing 18 because it's an easy example, but I think for each one of those, you have to say, well, there are different scenarios. And under those scenarios, the false positive looks different. I think the false positive has to be whatever causes harm.
Exactly.
And then your test data set needs to reflect that.
Yeah, I think a lot of the current usages today is about gating access to certain content. And there the harm is definitely in, are you giving kids access to content that they should have access to? But I agree that if you create a space, for example, for teenagers, there is harm in allowing adults into that. For sure.
Space. Yeah, exactly. That's the harm.
Point, it's not just how well do you do with adults, it's how well do you mitigate the harms that you're trying to protect against in your given model. And that almost is interesting too, because I feel like the correct threshold of certainty and performance you need for a given system and somewhat needs to be proportional to the risk.
The harm. So this whole idea of saying 90, 95, 99 or whatever, it feels like what those levels are really depends on the level of harm. Is that what you meant?
To some degree, and maybe assurance levels solve some of that. Maybe you could say that you need low assurance for certain use cases and high assurance for others. But I'm not even sure that like how you fully encode for the diversity of those things in benchmarking. Like maybe it's okay if people are off by like a year or two in certain use cases, like a safe space for teens. Oh, if you're like a year too young,
If you're
versus a year
18 or
too
19,
old,
well, or 19 or
like,
20,
there's
yeah.
a lot less risk there, I think, in that exposure than
Like
say
a 45-year-old, yeah.
So that's sort of interesting as well, because it's not just some of that wrongness is due to the proportionality of how wrong you are rather than just that you got it wrong.
Yeah, yeah.
And how far off you are. And I think that's also true for sometimes classifying people as minors. A 17-year-old getting access to content that's like maybe slightly racier but not super
Yes.
hazardous versus a 5-year-old is a very different risk profile as well.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So it feels like they really need to be it needs to be like, these are the sorts of statistics that we are interested in seeing, because they do tell you about the different types of errors, and you know that there are some errors are going to cause more harm and everything like that, but it needs to be very much, it can't be too specific, because it really depends on like what causes harm depends on the use case. And then also
and the definitions of what even is harm is so regionally informed and political to some extent. Like I think you see very diverse opinions on like adult content globally. You see very diverse opinions on the sensitivity of violence globally. And I think that that's also sort of interesting, because it's almost regional specific what that harm is that you're trying to protect against and how careful you need to be there. So some of it is also up to regulators and then users to tell us what they need in a given region. Yeah. What they're comfortable with in a given region. Yeah. Which is its own challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? It is like, it's hugely it's really interesting to think about. I think it feels to me, like you said, it's got to stay relatively generic, but helpful in terms of pointing people in the right direction of the sorts of things that are important, what errors are the most important, what the sorts of things you should be reporting to give people the right level of detail and information about it. But I don't think you can, for example, say, and this is what your test should look like, because this is how you should design your test, because each design of that test will depend on the use case in the real world deployment. And so that's going to have to be done by
although possibly there's design principles
you
could put towards.
For sure.
For example, a design principle was like, make sure your test population is similar to your user population.
Yeah. Make sure you've got a big enough sample size. This is the sort of thing you need to think about.
Users from diverse backgrounds in your data set. So I do think there are
parts
of the methodology that could be standardized and required without being so specific that it's like, this is exactly the test you need to run.
For sure. These are, you need to make sure that what you're doing reflects how it's going to be used in real life. You need to make sure that you have a sufficient number of test subjects. You need to make sure that the ages reflect the use case. You need to make sure that your test data set is representative of what you're going to test. Yeah, absolutely. There are definite obvious like design features that, it should be considered when putting it, and advice can be given for that. Yeah.
And maybe this is where it comes down to, I think one of the things they mentioned here is peer review. Maybe it is sort of like you're creating a paper on what your approach is and how you evaluated the correctness of that approach. And to some degree, that certification is then peer review that, yes, all of that seems reasonable. That seems like a good way to go about it. It meets the general best practices that we've laid out in the standard. It aligns with this and this. The evaluation of what the risk surfaces are seems reasonable, etc. Which is probably going to make it a very costly certification process on both ends, but also I don't know how else you could design it.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I don't know which question you want to come. Yeah, but I just want to say it's really important to maybe expand our binary result to, like, how do you say, like, third result, like unsure one, not sure one, because, and it is also related to periods, like I heard the requirement of accuracy to be like 99.99%. I mean, what if, like, we say we age checked 100 people from age 1 to 100, and so there must be some people who just turned 18, and how do you how can you be sure that person who just turned 18 can be over 18, or who what if there are just people who just be at the how do you say, the 18 this line? So I think if people are really randomly from the real life, we cannot guarantee the accuracy can be over 99.99% if someone who just within that age. So even if your model is super correct, can predict the exact age, but you cannot predict like the minutes or yeah. So it's not. I think naturally speaking, it's not possible to reach that accuracy. But if you just in your test data set, if you just take out all of the people whose age is around 17 to 20, maybe you can do that. But what if there are just some people whose age is exactly 18 or 17 to 19? I think it's maybe hard to really reach a goal of 99% that high accuracy.
I think that when I was talking to people about it last year, they were sort of saying that the people, so obviously you've got age verification, which is slightly different because that's like the hard identifiers and things like that. But the age estimation technology where people are estimating their ages, they were saying, of course, they couldn't reach that accuracy because around the age of threshold was just not possible. Yeah. And that the way that they would use their technology in practice would be using this idea of like an age buffer. So they would say, we are confident that if we find someone to be over 25, that they are over 18. Yeah. And then if they're not found to be over 25, they have to go through like a second level of age verification. So it's this idea of trying to minimize the friction. So you're only doing it to people that are, you know, where they are less confident. But then the alternative to that, actually, I think it's similar. It's very similar. The idea is this idea of the yes, no, and unsure, where the unsure is close to the, and again, I think the unsures then have to go through another step of age verification. It kind of is very similar, I think. But maybe the benefit of the latter one of just the unsure is that you don't actually have to say, right, 25, that's the cutoff, or you know, you're letting the technology assess its performance and its confidence for the different people. And then
it's interesting too. I think intuitively it seems like the users who we get wrong should be near the threshold, and maybe that's true in a lot of cases, but I think models can be really hard to build and evaluate, and sometimes users that are wrong are just like way off at one end of the spectrum or the other, and there it's not even just looking at close to the threshold. You're always going to have some amount of error in any system, and sometimes it comes from really unique sources. For example, if you have a user who has some really unique facial presentation, maybe they're the ones you have to error for and have a very poor job of calculating their age. And ideally your model would split out unsure, but that's hard to validate, especially if it's never been trained on a case like that. Yeah. Especially if it is something super uncommon. So yeah, I think that's definitely a challenge. And also some of the accuracy, I feel like at a certain point you get risks of attack vectors occurring at a certain rate beyond the accuracy. Like if you're evaluating a government ID solution, what percentage of kids are going to go steal a government ID out of their parents' wallet, to take a photo of? And is that larger than the percentage that we're benchmarking the model at needing to be correct at? And does the correctness have to also take into account the security measures? Or are they separate? What the risk is? Yeah, are they separate? I don't know. Like, is it just given a picture of a government ID, what percentage of the time you get correct, or is it are you properly ensuring that that is presented by the actual individual who owns that government ID
Yeah.
with high confidence as well?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know whether you do those two things separately or whether you try and combine them in some way. It's really hard. Yeah. Yeah.
I also think that, especially since attack vectors always evolve alongside systems, that it's very hard upfront to say what security should look like. And also, I'd say, due to attack vectors, a system that performs at 99.99% on one day could find a critical vulnerability the next and be down to 50%. And it's very hard to predict those things, or like a certification is just a snapshot at a point in time of the functioning. And I think, for example, a trained data set that's evaluated on, you can say, yes, with high confidence, you've met a certain benchmark. But in terms of real user use and abuse patterns, it gets a lot more challenging.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay.
I think we can finish up the remaining 3 questions in the next 10 minutes. So we can move to question 6, I think. How can benchmarking analysis accommodate the evolving nature of age verification technologies, ensuring that benchmarking standards remain relevant and up to date in the face of rapid innovation? Wow. I think we
sort of covered that. Yeah.
Results rather than anything about the specific method seems to be the answer there. Because if you measure results, those have to be somewhat unified and similar.
Yes. Yeah. You can say these are the types of metrics that we advise you to be using. This is the sorts of things that are important for us to look at and to understand, and that might be in terms of accuracy and bias and presentation attack.
So the 7th question is, what strategies can organizations employ to incentivize participation in benchmarking initiatives for age assurance system, and how can collaborative efforts within industry consortia or standardization bodies drive continuous improvement and knowledge sharing? First question.
I think a lot of this just comes from what regulators push for, what users push for at the end of the day, or if you're a business serving other businesses, what those other businesses are pushing for. I think it almost has to be communal to some extent of what's being requested of the systems and what standard is everybody being held to. It also feels like standards are important and critical. I feel like, especially when you're looking at something that could impact a business's ability to compete in a given market, are you going to want to necessarily filter all the kids out if you're not obligated to at a very specific point in time? Are you going to want to have a perfect system? If, for example, you could make more money if your system has some known built-in flaws. And certainly I'd say at my company, we do aim to try to build things that are age appropriate. We do aim to try to do the right thing for users. But I can't say that I trust every single organization to be working in that space. And I think that that's where standards and regulations and what users are asking for can help push for the right outcomes.
You mean from a feedback loop to ask the users and to give us suggestions?
And I think that but I do think that as an industry, it does feel like people, like, obviously, like, companies aren't going to share their solutions like there, but it does feel like it's an industry that are happy to come together to talk about this side of things. I think, because there are commonality, like challenges that are common. So I feel like it feels like there are forums for people to say, well, how are we going to address these challenges?
And I'd say sharing solutions isn't entirely viewed negatively. I'd say in a lot of ways, sharing solutions, like, often age assurance can be a very high friction thing for users. And for a lot of businesses, if there's an easier way, which would involve data sharing, it's quite compelling. I'd say wanting to give up that data about your users is obviously its own sort of double-edged sword, but I do feel like there is some amount of collaboration and cooperation
Yes.
that might evolve in this space. I don't feel like that's impossible.
No, I agree.
So the final question is, how should benchmarking results be communicated to stakeholders, including policymakers, regulators, and end users, to foster trust and confidence in the efficiency and reliability of age assurance system? And what role does transparency play in this process?
I think it's challenging to figure out the right granularity of information to share with different people, like to some extent.
Yeah.
Not everybody is going to necessarily be able to understand the information in its rawest form, but also at a certain point, are you putting it through so many layers of trying to dumb it down that you lose any of the meat
Yes.
of what you're trying to communicate? And that in and of itself is a challenge. I also think that the attitudes you're gonna get at, like, say, if you have an arbitrary model and you're like, oh, it has 90% precision, the attitudes you're gonna get from somebody who works in the machine learning space versus somebody who's never worked with machine learning before, and they're like, well, you get it wrong 1 in 10 times.
Yeah.
It's very different.
Yeah.
So from that perspective, I think also there almost has to be some framing education in what the feasibility space is, what is good, what's done to mitigate risks in certain cases, and I think trying to also explain to people sort of the spectrum of risk for different use cases and how those are addressed is its own challenge as well.
Yeah. It definitely feels as well like, you know, you've got end users, policymakers, regulators, stakeholders. I mean, they're all going to need different level of detail, aren't they? Like really, at the end of, you know, like it just doesn't feel like it feels like you can, yeah.
Not to mention end users, like here's our like precision and recall matrix for all of our machine learning models.
Yeah,
like just in front of you, like please look at this. Like nobody wants, like maybe the odd user in 1,000 will go look at a health center article.
Yeah.
Basically, I agree.
Yeah, I don't think end user. I mean, yeah, I think you probably need some information, but it needs to be really basic. Where it's like the person who's deploying that, if you're selling it to, you know, to a company to then deploy it, that company is going to want more reassurance, aren't they? Yeah, exactly. About exactly how it's been tested and checked.
And possibly that's where certifications could play a role.
I think so.
You say, hey, look, we have this independent body that looked at all of our methods and they certified our solution. And then people, if they can trust that independent body to do the certification,
yes, it
provides that like sort of transit trust of, oh, they weren't some big company acting in their own interest. They're saying it's reasonable. I can trust what this is doing without having to understand any of it. And
yeah,
I actually do think that's a big power of certification. It's an easy way to sort of reach user trust.
Yeah.
And it does have that nice independent feature where
exactly, but it's not. But the only issue with the certification is that it's, like we said before, it's not standard.
No.
Across use case. Do you see what I mean? I don't think as a technology you could just be like, we've been certified. I think you have to be, we've been certified for this deployment scenario, right?
Yes.
You know, which means do you have to be certified multiple times depending on what, how you, do you see what I mean? Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe then it's like, are they certifying your general approach and framework for approaching the problem, or are you certifying individual solutions?
Yes, that's what I meant.
Different, and maybe you could certify more general approaches if people agree to uphold those sorts of approaches in scaling their systems or in adding new functionality to their systems or new use cases for their systems.
Yeah. Yeah. Or whether, yeah, and also, yeah, whether a certification company is more about, like, we peer reviewed what this company is doing, you know, rather than doing it themselves in-house, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think you can scale doing it in-house given the diversity of solutions.
Yeah.
Like if someone has to come up with tests for something that's very different from looking at someone else described how they tested it in terms of the amount of work required.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments about the benchmarking?
I think so.
Yeah. So the next session is about indicator of confidence. I'm not sure if
Is that
you.
also here?
Yes,
Yeah.
you don't have to move.
Oh, great, good. Can I add you guys on LinkedIn?
Pardon?
Can I add you guys on LinkedIn?
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
Because yeah, I think definitely we can have a lot to talk about.
Are you based in the UK or have you come
It's, yeah,
so any of you come over for the conference?
yes.
Wow.
Yeah, my weekends are good plane trips, mostly,
Oh.
both sides. Think all in all,
You
like,
travel both sides?
I mean. You have to get home somehow, right?
Yeah.
So flew in Sunday night to arrive and flying out Saturday morning, and I get some weekends on the way home because you get home Saturday, but the
Yeah.
time zone takes you in that direction. And
Yeah.
flying your direction. That was
Do you have to travel much?
Mostly I end up traveling to California, which is not. So yes, I travel a lot,
But
it's
not
a very
such
different.
Yeah. How long does that take from Seattle to California?
I think the flight's usually a couple of hours.
Okay, yeah. So
Like more of the time around it is getting to the airport.
yeah, all the
back.
fat. Yeah.
Which is the international flight is so much worse. You could do the 3 hours instead of the 2.
Yeah, absolutely.
It adds up.
Yeah, of course.
There are no direct flights.
No, there wouldn't be. No. Did you get the train from London?
I actually just flew through Frankfurt.
Oh, and then actually got to Manchester. Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think switching to trains would have, I think I looked at it and it wasn't even much cheaper or.
No, and
much
also
faster.
there are various train strikes at the moment. So it's
Yeah,
like,
there's a lot of
yeah,
reasons.
no, I think that makes a lot
not
of sense.
viable.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I'm based down in the southwest of England. I got the train up this morning.
Where do you come from?
I live in Exeter.
Exeter.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
southwest.
far.
Yeah. So
Oh my God.
I booked a taxi for like 10 to 7 to go to the train station, and the taxi didn't turn up.
Oh no.
So then I had to literally like take both my kids, lift my 5-year-old up like in her pajamas, and then put them in the car for my husband to like take me to the train station. They were very understanding, fortunately, but pretty sleepy.
Oh God.
They weren't very impressed.
So you are on the travel in this morning?
I came up this morning, so I only arrived at lunchtime.
Okay. Oh.
You just for the day or?
No, I'm coming until Friday.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's nice.
Yeah.
I'm obviously here for the whole week.
Yes.
Not like that far.
Yeah.
Not going to come just for one
No.
day. There's a lot of folks who are more local, they're picking and choosing.
Yeah, but it's too like like the train was 7:20 and I got in at midday. It's a pretty lengthy train journey. So yeah, so I'm here till Friday now. So yeah, there's just so many sessions, aren't there?
It's kind of incredible. We had to sort of divide and conquer with 2 different folks from Google. And
Do you?
spend a lot of time just looking at the schedule and being like, well, you can go to this one and we'll go to this one, and that way we get some amount of coverage.
And do you have a Google your own like age estimation or age verification technology that you're sort of in building, or do you employ like
Both.
both? Yeah.